In today's complex environment, almost every major project, from mining to transmission lines, is contentious. Hi, my name is Allie, Meeres.
And I'm Byng, Giraud.
Welcome to Primary Risk, where each month we speak with the people behind the projects shaping our world.
We'll be hosting candid conversations and hearing from industry leaders, political figures, engineers, and project proponents. We'll be exploring the soft issue risks, challenges, and solutions, and behind-the-scenes stories of what it took to get these complex projects across the finish line. Or not.
The Honourable Jason Kenney is a seasoned political leader with over 25 years of experience in the Canadian federal and provincial elected offices. As the 18th Premier of Alberta, he championed the province's energy sector, fostered partnerships with Indigenous communities, and spearheaded initiatives to drive economic growth and investment. Under his leadership, Alberta introduced transformative strategies such as the Alberta Recovery Plan, Natural Gas Vision and Strategy, Hydrogen Roadmap, and the groundbreaking Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, or AIOC. Before serving as Premier, Jason held several prominent federal cabinet roles between 2007 and 2015, including Minister for Citizenship, Immigration, and Multiculturalism, Minister of Employment and Social Development, Minister of National Defence, and Chair of the Cabinet Operations Committee. First elected as a Member of Parliament in 1997, he has also been re-elected 6 times. Jason's career began as president of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation in the 90s, where he established himself as an advocate for fiscal responsibility and accountability. Today, he brings his expertise in leadership, vision, and public policy to his role at Bennett Jones, where he continues to contribute to Canada's economic and social development. Jason, we are so grateful to have you here today.
Great to be here.
Thanks for coming in. Well, I know you and Byng go way back, and I'm sure about 99% of our listeners know who you are. But for that 1%, and maybe just to let me know and give me a little bit more color, you've been a politician for almost your whole career. What got you interested in politics from the very beginning?
Just the part of it is just I never could sit on the sidelines watching this people make decisions for our society indifferently or passively or distantly. I always felt like, they said of the Duke of Wellington that I felt compelled to march towards the sound of gunfire. Like if there's a fight, I needed to take a role, take a position, and maybe it has something to do with my Irish background. So I've always had strong convictions, and I always felt compelled to advance them and not be a spectator. So that's really what drew me in.
Well, great. What we want to talk today, because our podcast is obviously primary risk. We call it primary risk because we believe one of the big challenges with major projects are the subjective risks that go along with getting approvals. And this is something you've had a lot of experience in. And so we want to start maybe with one of what I think is one of the iconic and sort of probably one of your significant legacies from when you were Premier of Alberta was the creation of the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. And for those listeners that aren't totally familiar with it, Google it, AIOC. Essentially, it's a government program that backstops loans to allow Indigenous communities to take equity positions in major projects, and hopefully, I guess, align interests and allow those projects to be built. Obviously, as we're quite interested in this podcast in major projects and enabling those major projects, we're seeing more and more of this. So let's maybe go back to the beginnings of AIOC. Why? And how did you put it together? And then I want to talk a little bit more about what resistances there might have been to creating a program, because not every province has it.
I'm so glad you asked, because I really think that it has been a key inflection point in moving most First Nations, at least in Western Canada, to being either very enthusiastic about or at least open to cooperation, participation in major resource projects. I think it's been a game changer. So the story is that the NDP came to office in Alberta in 2015, around the same time that Justin Trudeau did in Ottawa. And between the two of them, between increases in taxes, massive increases in regulation, the cancellation of Northern Gateway, the killing of Energy East, et cetera, there was a huge flight of investment and jobs away from Alberta's largest industry, oil and gas. So you had tens of thousands of white-collar professionals in primarily downtown Calgary who got laid off, and tens of thousands of blue-collar tradespeople in rural Alberta who lost their jobs. We had 4 or 5 years of economic decline and stagnation. So I took on the really challenging task of reassembling 2 warring pro-enterprise parties in Alberta, center-right parties. That took like 3 years, and then we managed to get that merger through. And then I wanted to put in the window a very bold, detailed plan to get Alberta's economy back on track, to attract investment back, to get big infrastructure done, to get pipelines advanced, to get oil and gas projects green-lighted. And none of that was going to happen without Indigenous participation. If we had a discussion around a table like this or energy industry office in Calgary 8 or 10 years ago, by far the biggest elephant in the room as a barrier to major projects was the lack of Indigenous consent or support, the ambiguity around the constitutional responsibility of project proponents and the Crown to discharge their Section 35 obligations to consult First Nations. And so, that was really being symbolized in the opposition to both Northern Gateway and the Trans Mountain expansion. So I realized, in kind of big strategic terms, that we had to do something different to get Indigenous communities to literally buy into projects. So I started, in Alberta in particular, as there is a long history of participation, cooperation between energy companies and Indigenous people. The biggest employer of Indigenous Albertans by far is oil and gas. And let me just add that the average income for an Indigenous Canadian working in the oil and gas sector is like almost 4 times higher than in the general Indigenous population in Canada. So this has been a huge elevator of social mobility, of opportunity. You can go to First Nations reserves like Fort McKay, right near Fort McMurray, in the heart of the oil sands, and it's a wealthy community. There's a whole bunch of millionaires with beautiful streets, manicured lawns, rec centers, infrastructure, because of 40 years of visionary leadership on the part of their nation participating with the industry. So I thought, how do we replicate models like that? And here in BC, you had some really positive models, obviously West Bank and Clarence Louis and some of the nations in the interior. So as I was speaking to those friends of mine who were, pro-growth, pro-prosperity, people like Chief Billy Morin, who's now a Conservative MP from Edmonton. He was chief of the Enoch Cree First Nation, and others. What I realized was that the big barrier, the big goal was equity ownership, actual ownership, moving beyond the old paradigm, the old model, which was industrial benefit agreements with Indigenous communities. The old model, if we were talking like even 10 years ago, certainly 30 years ago, a mining company, lumber company, oil and gas pipeline, linear infrastructure company would show up at the end of the process, not the beginning, speak to the representatives of a First Nation, and they would say, by the way, we're doing this project, we've got the approvals, and we'll agree to hire 10 of your guys to do
some clearing or something.
Clearing, and some of your guys to do security, and maybe some guys to run the shuttle bus. And by the way, we'll send your nation $250,000 a year. These were, as some of my First Nations friends call it, these were like beads and trinkets, a reference to how First Nations were scammed back in the old days by the European traders. And they were saying to me, we're not going to get scammed anymore. We see these big projects, we're prepared to support them if they are environmentally sound, but only if they're involving our traditional territories and obviously our reserve lands, we need equity ownership. But the barrier was almost none of them have balance sheets because of the colonial nature of the Indian Act means that there's no fee simple property. So no individual, no company, not even the nation itself has something that a bank would recognize as nothing to borrow against, liquid asset that they could use as collateral to get a loan. And a lot of them, those who don't have the happy history of a Fort McKay with like decades of development and business advice and so on, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the balance sheet, and they don't have experience in doing this stuff. So I thought, we need to bridge that gap. The barrier is a lack of access to capital and an inability to borrow at commercial rates. So I thought to myself, and then I was being asked, could you do something to be like, there is a grievance amongst many Indigenous Canadians, Western Canadians in Saskatchewan and Alberta in particular, that the national resource transfer agreements of the 1930s, which gave Alberta and Sask ownership of their mineral rights, went to the provincial crowns as opposed to the Indigenous communities. And so their ask was, can you recognize that by giving us a share of royalties? And I'm like, folks, your folks go to the provincial hospitals, drive on the provincial highways, many of them go to provincial schools that we pay for through those royalties. So we can't really cannibalize those royalties. But let's look at this another way. What if we were to use the good faith and credit of the Alberta Crown, which has a heritage fund, a savings fund, to backstop investments that you make to get commercial access to commercial rates of credit so you could buy equity in pipelines, in major projects. And so I announced that as part of our 2019 platform. And I thought I was taking some big risks politically doing it, but it worked out both politically and then substantively.
You did get some pushback, though, and one of the things I think you did get pushback on was whether or not the program should remain sector agnostic. And we understand that when the federal Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program was being created, they had the same internal conversations around the cabinet table on, should it just be clean energy projects? Should it include oil and gas projects? So what was that like maneuvering through it? And a lot of the projects, of course, in Alberta are oil and gas rate regulated utilities. However, outside of Alberta, there might be more on the mining side.
Let me throw one more thing in there, just to add to your answer. Also, the resistance you would have is, are we putting taxpayers' dollars at risk to backstopping loans?
Yeah, let me address that first, because I think that was quite frankly, in terms of, let's back the camera up. Okay. In terms of relations between Indigenous Canadian reconciliation, relations between Indigenous Canadians and the Canadian business community and the governments and the broader community. I think this was really important because I just described in Alberta that had gone through 5 years of economic decline and stagnation, hundreds of thousands of unemployed people. Our GDP between 2015 and 2019 had gone from $365 billion to $315 billion. Like, we were markedly poorer as a province, and a lot of people were hurting. A lot of guys and gals had been out of work for like 3-4 years. And so I was very concerned that if they heard me saying, we're going to set aside $1 billion for the First Nations, for Indigenous communities, while these folks, mostly non-Indigenous working class people, were out of work, I was a little concerned that this could trigger a backlash along racial grounds, to be perfectly honest with you. I am so happy to say that was not the case, not at all. Albertans got it. Unemployed people from the oil patch got it. They understood that we weren't going to have a future for the industry without full Indigenous participation. And you know why? One of the reasons is because Indigenous people have been working in the industry, as I said, for so long that you go to any drilling pad in Alberta, any work crew in the oil sands, any service company that is adjacent to the industry, and you're going to find at least one and sometimes several First Nations folks in that workforce. And so I just wanted to say that the industry has brought people together and broken down barriers and mistrust and stereotypes such that when I took this risk, this political risk, it was enthusiastically embraced. So I was so excited about that. On the actual programmatic side of it, look, when I first framed it as, in my mind, my overwhelming goal was to get First Nations participation in pipelines. So we made it originally natural resource projects, and we gradually expanded it from there to include ag and telcos. And frankly, I just think these things should be very broad. But the key is this is not a check writing scheme. This is not a giveaway program. These have to be commercially viable deals, which have gone through real rigor and have been subject to serious scrutiny by legal, accounting, the technical, the people who structure these kinds of deals, because the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation ensures that. They went much slower in endorsing more deals than I would have liked politically, because they wanted to ensure that rigor. The whole concept would have failed if they were underwriting commercially non-viable projects. It would have created renewed cynicism about the capacity of Indigenous communities to step up on big projects like this. So I think the rigor that they've brought to it, the commercial rigor to these deals, has helped to enhance capacity amongst the partner nations who are operating typically through consortia with access to the best advisory services, the best law firms and banking advisors. And I think that's helped to enhance it. So I think the key is whatever industries you include in the criteria, it's got to be commercially viable deals.
Yeah, and I think that's a nuance and I think there's still some misconceptions. So I want to touch on two things. And I think it's really important for our listeners and for you and Byng and I who kind of work in this area. And we just came off of doing the Enbridge deal with 36 nations in BC. And I handled all the media for that. And it was very interesting talking to reporters who are dealing with all sorts of stories in the natural resource sector and beyond. There's two nuances. One is that this is not a check writing activity. Yeah. So the loan guarantee program is a loan guarantee, not a loan.
Right.
It's not a grant program. And
yeah, it's not as they say, not a non-repayable loan.
Exactly. And the Indian Act part that you talked about is a big part of that, right? It's access to actual, I think a lot of First Nations that have gone out pre-loan guarantee programs, we're looking at credit card rates for loans, right? Which is untenable for these types of equity deals. And I think the second thing too is that there is a difference between these business deals and rights and title. And I think that's the next chapter in boardrooms in Canada where that needs to be really understood, because I had a bit of a brush up with a reporter on this who really went after our spokesperson on rights and title. And what I had to say to him afterwards is, this is a commercial business deal. Technically speaking, these nations could, if the pipeline was going to be expanded, the nations could actually sue the company or take them to court on the rights and title side and still be an equity owner in the pipeline, technically.
Separating government and business interests.
And I think that those are important delineations to make.
Yeah, look, none of this surrenders whatever treaty or in BC other non-treaty enumerated rights that First Nations have. This is, but that mindset, starting with that. Let me be blunt. There's a whole industry centered here in Vancouver, which has monetized Indigenous opposition to major projects. And I think it's been a terrible disservice to Indigenous communities by these NGOs and lawyers and others who have done that, often funded by U.S. environmental NGOs, we call them environmental non-government organizations, who have, I think, to use the phrase of former Haisla chief counselor and now member of parliament Ellis Ross, have engaged in, quotes, eco-colonialism. They have looked at First Nations as kind of, people who have no desire to improve their quality or standard of living, to participate fully in the modern economy, but rather as just sort of guardians of some mystic concept of nature, and that if we just, we'll just constantly leverage the legal and political and moral authority of Indigenous people to block projects, not to help First Nations, but to satisfy the moral agenda of often very wealthy. By the way, Tom Steyer in San Francisco is a massive billionaire who's been the biggest donor to the Tides Foundation and to all of these things, trying to block these pipelines, for example. He doesn't need to worry about poverty like Ellis Ross did, as he didn't have to worry about addictions and lack of hope that exists in so many of our Indigenous communities. So these American green billionaires were able to play out their moral drama at the expense of opportunity for First Nations. I think we need to totally change the paradigm, which is what I was trying to do with AIOC, to say that Indigenous communities, yes, they have rights and title, which include the right to say yes to prosperity. Those rights don't simply mean the right to say no to block, obstruct projects. They mean the right to be fully consulted, to participate, to if there is a critical, let's face it, if there's a critical mass of deep opposition to a particular project by proximate First Nations, it's not going to happen. That's just a legal reality. So if there are things that people our communities are really opposed to, they will express that. They have the legal tools, the political authority. But we're trying to say, a lot of them want to say yes, and we're trying to help them to get to yes, where they want to go forward in moving their people from poverty to prosperity. And I think one of the reasons this is working is because there is a new generation of Indigenous leaders. I mean, Ellis Ross and Billy Morin are two sterling examples.
Yeah, Chief Willie Sellers, Chief David Jimmy.
And
Chief
many,
Charlie
many
Neal.
more. I can tell you in Alberta, of our 46 First Nations bands under the 3 treaty groups, and I would meet with them constantly. I would meet with the treaty groups. I would meet with we would do Crown Indigenous meetings with all of the nations. I would go out and meet them individually. I would say easily over 40 of the 46 have as their kind of disposition is pro-responsible resource development.
So on that though, we've got a program that I think we're taking advantage of in Alberta that is held up as the example. Other provinces are considering it. Saskatchewan's got something underway. Ontario's got something underway. The feds, the Enbridge deal was probably the first. What can we do to improve it? And lessons we could give, here in British Columbia, it was announced over a year ago. We still don't have a program. What lessons would you take from that? What advice would you give to those provinces in terms of that need to create the programs? And what might you actually improve or change?
Well, we were very happy to see, like, one of the reasons I did this and a lot of other public policy reforms in Alberta was to use Alberta as a policy laboratory. That's what federalism can be at its best. And it has worked exactly as I hoped, because other provinces on this score, on Indigenous loan guarantee programs, have replicated Alberta's model in varying ways. Saskatchewan was the first to come in on a smaller scale. The province is smaller in scale, obviously. Let me tell you an interesting story about that. Premier Moe tells me that after his first agreement that was backstopped by the Saskatchewan Crown Corp on this, I don't know what the project was.
It was the 7 Stars Enbridge Wind project.
Very good. You know your stuff. And he tells me that some of the chiefs approached him and said, we're familiar with all of these environmental and regulatory steps. What can we do to really accelerate that as much as possible? That's the point. Suddenly, when you're an owner, you look at things differently, right? And so Saskatchewan's gone forward. Now, BC replicated it in principle, but they were late in coming, and I don't understand why.
Well, we can't either. We're asking that question a lot these days. We have a couple clients, and actually the interesting thing is there's a bit of a dichotomy between what's going on in the province. So we have our second call for power year to year. We had one in 2024. We just got another one in 2025. And actually in the call for power, you must have a minimum of 25% equity ownership with First Nations in that call for power. But there's no loan guarantee program in British Columbia.
So the private sector, in many respects, will carry that, which is when they can, they should. But that's going to exclude a lot of First Nations.
Yeah, and the private sector, as you know, they're in many instances have been doing that without government backstop. But by the way, when I created the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, we made it eligible for projects in British Columbia, because we know a lot of the linear infrastructure.
You just had to have a majority Alberta First Nation participation.
Because we knew, if we're going to get any pipelines built, it's going to have to involve BC First Nations, right? So we got ahead of the BC government on BC in First Nations, and I was all over my late friend, John Horgan, to do this. And John, I thought, just seemed like well-disposed to do it. He was a pro-jobs New Democrat, and he was very focused on Indigenous reconciliation, what we call reconciliation in Alberta. I also, by the way, 3 days after I was sworn in as premier, I was in Justin Trudeau's office in Ottawa. And one of my very first points was, we are creating this Crown Corp in Alberta. We're going to have it done within 6 months. We did. We encourage you to do the same thing. And by the way, if you want to do this as a joint venture, let's show that Alberta and Ottawa can work together.
Well, the stacking of these really makes sense.
I
right?
was going to say, can you give us some color if you were having those conversations? How would you stack the federal program now with the provincial programs? Because this hasn't been done yet. We're hoping to see it soon.
Yeah, I don't think it's complicated. They're entirely complementary. But the point is, at first he was, he just thought that was a nice idea. And then, 18 months later, they announced the intention to consult about it in a budget. And then there was another 2 years of consultation. And then they finally created it. What we did in 6 months, it literally took Ottawa 5 years to do. Yeah. But now it's there. And thank you, Prime Minister Kenney, for committing to expand it. I think absolutely these things are stackable. I'm on corporate boards and I'm involved in various advisory roles. And I will tell you that in almost every major project discussion that I have, one of the first items on the agenda when they're talking about their capital stack is how to include First Nations and in that process, how to leverage these government loan guarantee programs. So the private sector is right there, and they're going to be putting forward, they already are putting forward proposals, I think, that stack provincial and federal loan guarantees.
So one of the other things we're seeing with other provinces and other levels of government looking at this is the constraints on this system. And I have an opinion, but I'd like to hear yours. You create a loan guarantee, but oftentimes we're seeing other political objectives trying to be achieved. If the primary objective is to align interests and get these projects built and get First Nations involved, but now we're seeing, we did see this discussion federally. Luckily, we got over it. Oh, maybe we should exclude hydrocarbons or oil and gas. We're hearing in other provinces, it can only be new projects. There seems to be other political agendas being layered on this. Yeah. My opinion is, let's just stick with what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, keep it simple, stupid. It should be a theme on programs like this. Don't make these programs too complicated. This is something Ottawa always does. I mean, just think, I'm sorry to go off on a tangent here, but
we love a good rant.
The infrastructure
on this
bank.
Think about the Impact Assessment Act, C-69. I'm the guy that branded it the No More Pipelines Law and challenged it in court. Supreme Court overturned it, unconstitutional violation of provincial jurisdiction and all of that. But in there, if you're going to, build a pipeline, you have to do a gender-based plus analysis. I don't know what gender a pipeline is. And all of these extraneous things, endless box-ticking exercises. And if they lard up the federal Indigenous loan guarantee program with that kind of, everything has to be done in 24 different languages, and there has to be, kind of a caricature of Ottawa process obsession, it won't work. So it has to be commercial. Mm-hmm. It has to be, they have to operate with commercially viable deals, but that also means when they get credible proposals, they have to move those forward at the speed of business, not the speed of government. Now, the fact that it took Ottawa 5 years to set that thing up doesn't fill me with confidence. I don't want to be too cynical or critical about this, but they should basically talk to AIOC and say, how did you do this? And just basically replicate it.
And they have, to their credit, CDEV and its new subsidiary, the Canadian Indigenous Loan Guarantee Corporation, who just announced their chairman, and I think the CEO is incoming, have done a pretty fast job for Ottawa from the time that it was kind of passed to the time it was stood up, and actually on the deal we just came off of.
Once they passed the legislation, it
actually, we got a loan guarantee, right? They've announced one.
Awesome.
Now, I would ask you, and maybe on behalf of our listeners, maybe you can consult David Eby on this, because we still don't have a program in BC. And I think that's kind of where, you look at a deal like this that's done, they could have really also benefited from a BC loan
in the
guarantee
context
program.
of the current. So now we may have a consensus that access to tidewater is important.
Yeah.
Isn't now the time to strike?
And, and a program like this would not only complement the sort of larger linear projects, but projects that go to tidewater, as well as the clean energy projects that are part of this call for power. So we do want to get a little bit into the federal weeds on a couple things with you, if that's okay.
I was in Ottawa for 20 years, so okay. I lived in those weeds.
Okay, great. Well, and we're really interested to know your thoughts on the trade corridors. It's a huge hot topic of discussion right now. What do you see as the key opportunities and challenges in developing trade corridors?
Energy corridors,
yeah. And who should be developing?
Who's tidewater where? Quebec,
yeah,
BC, all the factors.
Well, I think Prime Minister Kenney has. Well, first of all, I think the Trump threat and imperative has focused everyone's minds.
We love it, actually.
Teenagers kicked off the coach. That's
never waste a good crisis. Okay,
totally.
And that's kind of Kenney's theme. And he seems to be leveraging that in the right way to bring everybody to the table with a sense of urgency. Except, I may add, your premier, who for some reason was touring convenience stores in Tokyo.
No comment.
rather than, well, I am commenting, rather than being at perhaps the most important meeting of Canadian premiers since the patriation of the Constitution in 1982. I don't know what he or his staff were thinking, but this is a really poor comment, reflection, I should say, on priorities. I think, Canadians want to come together. And if the politicians don't, the public is going to drag them kicking and screaming towards cooperating on major projects. You even see this in Quebec. I mean, we were always in majority territory in most of Canada and favored generically of oil and gas pipelines. Those numbers have gone up by like 20 points. And we're in majority, and in some polls, super majority territory in Quebec on LNG, on lifting the ban on gas, domestic gas production in Quebec, on an oil pipeline. And in fact, speaking of the politicians following the public, there was a fascinating debate of the Quebec Liberal Party leadership, the provincial party, 3 weeks ago in Montreal. I think there were 5 candidates, one of whom was Pablo Rodriguez, who I used to know is somebody quite on the green left of the Liberal Party of Canada. All 5 of the candidates said they were now in favor of lifting the ban on gas development, LNG, and oil pipelines. It's astonishing. The Quebec Liberal Party had, in recent years, become like a hardcore Green Party. So this is, I'm trying to convey to Westerners who maybe not follow Quebec politics, this is a sea change. These things are happening. And my message is to my friends in Victoria, in the government, get with the program here. Because it is, the country is looking, First Nations, there's been this, I think, transformation in, perhaps not with all First Nations, and it may be more in the West than Central Canada, and maybe more in Alberta than BC, but still, broadly speaking, First Nations want to participate in these projects, and they're showing that, they're showing us that through their actions, through these projects they're signing on to.
The Nisga'a Silasams LNG project was not on the province's priority list.
There was a priority list. Did you see the priority list? We did a whole podcast on it. There was 10 projects on it. Only a couple of
15.
them were actually new projects. The rest were all previously announced projects, but they were meant to kind of tell the public that these are the priority projects and we're going to expedite them with support of government and remove some of the permitting from them. And absent in that list was actually the Silasams project, which is
that because BC didn't put it on their list?
It wasn't.
No,
This was BC's list.
list.
Oh, I see. Yeah. I see. With respect to that legislation introduced here.
And so which was interesting for us because that's a Indigenous and majority owned project, and we see that it is a gas project, LNG, but
LNG, which will reduce global emissions.
Of course, yeah, we're big globalists here. I always read statistics which always don't really get picked up by major media around the displacement. There was a recent statistic I read that if we sort of exported all the potential gas that we have to LNG to Asia, we could reduce their emissions by 98% of Canada's emissions. Yeah. So that's the impact we could have. Neutral.
Yeah. No. I know that's kind of like a mental exercise because it will never actually displace that much. I know. But it makes the point.
It makes the point. But on the trade corridor side, so what I'm hearing from you in your commentary is we have a little bit more forward movement on the Quebec side. What about some potential new opportunities? We've talked about the potential for
and let's say I'm not convinced this is a window that's going to be open up for very long.
I agree.
Yeah, we might have some short distance on this one.
Yeah.
But if the Carney government moves quickly, how are they gonna where do you see them moving the trade corridor through? If they had to pick West Coast, East Coast, or
Churchill?
Maybe Churchill.
Well, look, I would advise sort of take an all of the above strategy. But there seems to be a lot of momentum behind this idea of a Kitimat to Churchill resource corridor that would kind of pass through the oil sands and through the mining areas of northern Saskatchewan and through northern Manitoba. I think that has some merit. It would also allow both Manitoba and BC. It would facilitate hydro tie-ins for the prairie provinces. Saskatchewan is leaning forward heavily on nuclear. It could prospectively help them to export nuclear-generated electricity in the future. So it could. Albertans have always wanted to build a solid highway between Grand Prairie and Fort McMurray that could be part of that to facilitate trade in northern Alberta. So that would help lumber and all sorts of industries, would help ordinary First Nations getting around northern Alberta. So there's lots of interest in that. Obviously, for the northern Alberta to northern BC road to Kitimat or Prince Rupert makes enormous sense because these are passes through the mountains that already have linear infrastructure, railways, highways, power lines, etc. Building on what is already there makes a heck of a lot of sense. I think that's where you start, rather than completely de novo projects that will take forever. The big one that got sort of lift in the election campaign was Energy East, which would be to twin the Trans-Canada gas pipeline that goes from Edmonton to southern Ontario over the Lakehead with a new oil pipeline. When TC Energy, then called Trans-Canada Pipeline, first proposed Energy East as an oil pipeline project to go to push about 800,000 barrels a day all the way out to the Irving refinery in St. John, New Brunswick, when they proposed that, their old Trans-Canada gas pipeline that was built in 1958 was operating well below capacity. So their idea was to optimize its value, convert it to an oil pipeline, ship a much more valuable product down that line, and then some line reversals and some tie-ins to take it all the way down to New Brunswick. The problem is now that gas consumption has increased so much, gas demand, that pipeline is almost at full capacity at peak season. So they can't convert it. It doesn't make any sense for them to convert it to oil. So you'd have to build an entirely de novo oil pipeline. And if the strategic appeal per Trump and Canadian sovereignty, Canadian energy security, is to go over the Lakehead through the Northern Shield, the Canadian Shield, so that Ontario and Central Canada are not dependent on Canadian oil that flows to Sarnia through Line 5 across the Straits of Mackinac, which, by the way, the threat is not just Trump. The Democrat governor and Attorney General of Michigan have been trying to shut down Line 5 across the Straits of Mackinac, which would shut down the Ontario economy. And you could imagine, who knows, a President Gavin Newsom trying to pull a stunt like that for green reasons. So there's a certain kind of energy security, national sovereignty argument for a big pipeline over the Northern Ontario. Small problem, doing a project like that de novo, what the people in the industry tell me, we're talking $80 billion plus. There's actually, I hate to sound like Justin Trudeau, but there's not going to be a private sector proponent that comes forward on a project of that scale without government de-risking.
This is a really important question. Yeah. So my sort of pithy view of TMX is the wrong party took the wrong risk. The company tried to get all the regulatory approvals and ran into the problems we all know. We know how the story ends. And then the government takes over the construction and early stage operation. The wrong party had the wrong risk. Government's sort of waiting for companies to come as supplicants and say, I want to build this project, and the government sort of taking hands off. Good luck with that through our process. That's over. We need government, frankly, to be part of either the lead or be part of the advocacy of a project to choose, which kind of rankles against me as a free marketer that government has to play that role. But the process has gotten so complicated and so onerous and so restrictive that, even the most flush private sector partner, are they ever going to propose projects of this scale ever again?
And what I hear from your BC government is they're playing that they've created the regulatory uncertainty has precluded any expression of interest from industry on major projects, or certainly like oil pipelines. So they turn around and say, you see, there's no interest. So why would we change the regulations that have prevented the interest? It's a totally circular. They've set themselves up purposely for failure on many of these projects.
So when we're thinking of a trade corridor, then we're thinking of Carney coming in and making these big political commitments, frankly, huge political commitments. Do you think it's the government's job to go out and actually permit these corridors and then turn around and sell them to the private sector? Do you think that's the way that we have to move? I mean, you had a big project that you supported in Alberta that sort of didn't end up happening, but
you mean Keystone XL?
Yes.
Well, hold on. Let's just pause on that if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So, I don't want to sound defensive.
Go for it.
But I will tell you now, this is unorthodox, because all of the impulse is Canadian infrastructure, diversifying exports away from the United States. I get it. But let me make a pitch to you. When you look at all the challenges of a West Coast pipeline, or frankly, I am not. I've always been an all of the above person on these projects, and we can get Manitoba on side broadly with kind of linear infrastructure, with the concept that it might help Hudson's Bay in the future. Great, but frankly, the economics will not work to move oil through Hudson's Bay anytime soon. There's not going to be fully a navigable season. You have to bring in very small tankers. You have to have icebreakers to clear them. It is a huge, economically very, I think, challenging concept to move hydrocarbons through Hudson's Bay. I've talked about the cost difficulty of Energy East. So what are we left with? Well, guess what? In that project that I underwrote through TC Energy, the Keystone XL project, I had to step up as premier to underwrite it because the capital markets would not take the political risk for the same reasons that the government of Canada came in to backfill after Kinder Morgan left the TMX project. So I came in behind with loan guarantees and an equity investment. And guess what? We strung the pipe between Hardisty and the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border. I think there's like 350, 400 clicks of pipe in the ground there. It's done on that side. A lot of it is already in place in the United States. Here's my argument. I think by far the most economically efficient major additional prospective Canadian oil pipeline for export would be another one down to the U.S. Gulf refinery complex. Now, how does that satisfy our desire to diversify exports away from the United States? Well, I'll put it this way. Donald Trump says he wants to stop the Canadian ripoff. He doesn't need our oil, doesn't need our gas, but he wants KXL. He does. He says that all the time. He wants another Canadian pipeline because he knows that they buy that at a discount, 15, 20% discount, and he must know that it's either our heavy crude or it's Venezuelan or Iranian heavy crude. Mm-hmm. So U.S. national security, it's a great commercial deal. They upgrade it and sell it at like 3x the price of the feedstock. It's an amazingly good deal from the United States. And if we were to build that, another 800,000, 900,000 barrels a day of egress from the oil sands, it would greenlight new upstream major capital investment as long as Carney lifts the emissions cap and other things. So here's my point. How about a judo move? How about make Donald Trump buy into more Canadian oil imports that would actually increase our goods surplus over the United States? Make it his idea. He could easily designate that under the U.S. Defense Procurement Act to rapidly get the project done on the U.S. side. Anyway, I think governments, them,
Have
us,
you got your
whoever,
ticket booked to Washington for this?
Yeah, I've already pitched a lot of people in Washington. They like the idea. I hope it didn't take up too much time on that.
No, we hear Danielle Smith was down at Mar-a-Lago having the same conversation. So I think it's, I think that's happening.
She likes to do that, sort of.
Okay, so I'm interested to dig a bit more into the C69 and AIOC because you've touched on both of those. So, we're in this trade corridor time within Canada. If you could only choose one policy shift to make coming out of Ottawa right now, either rescinding of legislation or putting in new legislation, like what would you do that would help spur more investment into Canada on some of these major projects?
Yeah, effectively repeal C69, the Impact Assessment Act. And as I've said, it's not even up for debate. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled that it was unconstitutional in a case that I led, but was supported by 8 other provinces. So if Prime Minister Carney wants to show partnership and respect for federalism for the provinces and get big things done, then listen to 9 of the 10 yours is the only province that wasn't. But they came in as interveners just to observe the legal process. But we had 9 provinces opposed to the act. And by the way, even Justin Trudeau's Senate, like the Senate that he appointed largely, voted basically to void the C69, the Impact Assessment Act, when it was a bill before Parliament because they saw how destructive it would be for the Canadian economy and how divisive it would be for national unity. So you had the Senate, this is not some crazy Western right-winger talking here. This is like the de facto Liberal Senate of Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Alberta Appeals Court, 9 of the 10 provinces, the entire Canadian industry, with the, I will say it, shameful exception of the Canadian Mining Association. I have no idea what the
they didn't participate at all.
Oh, no, they supported it.
They were publicly supporting it.
It's funny thing is I talked to many of the CEOs of the mining companies, and they are angry about that. But
what do we think has to happen for it actually to get repealed? Will it get repealed? How do you think that's going to roll out?
well, the federal Liberal government's position is that under Trudeau, they made necessary amendments to conform with the Supreme Court ruling. Alberta is now challenging that. And if I could throw out an advert here, it was actually Bennett Jones, the firm where I'm a senior advisor, that did the challenge on behalf of Alberta as legal counsel. It was a brilliant constitutional case that Sean Asley and the team there led. And they're picking up the same legal team is going to go back to, I think, initially to the Alberta Appeal Court, then the Supreme Court of Canada.
But what objective is Canada trying to satisfy here by getting into these dogfights? Like, just work together.
Like I said, this is not some fringe, this is not the demand of like Alberta separatists or something. This is the Supreme Court of Canada, the Senate of Canada, 9 of 10 provinces, every major industry group save one. This is, if anything, everybody's watching Prime Minister Carney to see if he is going to meet the aspirational rhetoric and the high expectations. This would be one very simple way of doing so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he'd satisfy the West, which I think is something he's going to have to balance, right? There's a lot of talk of corridors and pipelines, and that is happening in a lot of Western Canada, coming out of Western Canada. So there has to be
But this is not an East-West issue. Guess who are the biggest defenders of provincial jurisdiction under the Constitution and opponents of federal intrusion? Quebec. Francois Legault was the first guy to sign on to my constitutional challenge of Z69. Ontario is totally opposed to it. So all of the provinces, this is a thing. It's national unity. It's pro-growth. It's pro-constitution. We had a bunch of Indigenous groups that intervened to support Alberta's case on C69. So just get it done.
Give us some advice. So you're a former premier, you're a former cabinet minister. Your vision. Give us your advice. How do we take advantage of what I believe is a pretty short window?
Yeah.
Like, what do we do?
We need leadership, and so far, Prime Minister Carney seems to be exercising that. I will say, I've spoken to a number of people who were at his roundtable with energy industry leaders in Calgary, and they were very pleased with what he heard. And these are some folks who have been disappointed many times in the past. So what we need is now to move from the good intentions and the convening of national leadership that he has demonstrated to real action. And that means, look, expanding these Indigenous co-ownership programs. It's now the price of admission for major industry. We all know that, which is awesome. Yeah. It's table stakes. So that's excellent. And I think we have massively improved on what was the hugest barrier to major projects 5 or 10 years ago. Now it's about deregulation and some, I regret to say, as a free market type and a fiscal conservative, there's going to have to be some de-risking for some of these projects, at least in the initial phases, at least for the permit application phase, because TC Energy blew out $800 million on the Energy East project. I don't know how much Enbridge lost, hundreds of millions, 600 million
billions
more
lost by those
on Northern Gateway.
Those 10 LNG projects in the Northwest.
Right. So I think at the very least, those infrastructure companies are going to look at. They're going to say to the government, "Okay, you invited us to come forward. You say that's in the urgent national interest. Here's a project, but I'm sorry, our board is not going to green light hundreds of millions of dollars just for the application phase to buy a pig in a poke. So there has to be, I think, some fiscal framework to deal with some of those upfront risks, and then afterwards, project finance it, whatever.
Change the house odds. We've got to change the odds in the house. Right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, listen, Jason, it was an absolute pleasure to have you on. We really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for getting into the weeds with us on building major projects and primary risks of those projects. Thanks to our audience for listening to this episode.
Us old St. Mike's guys still got some ideas.
Yeah, you guys have great ideas. I'm still soaking it in and learning. Please follow us to receive notifications, upcoming episodes, wherever you get your podcasts. Check out the show notes for references to all the materials that Jason mentioned during today's discussion. And new episodes will be released monthly. I know Byng and I are planning to do another podcast, just the two of us, before summer.
It's one of our rant casts.
Yes, it's a rant cast. Stay tuned. It's
Wasn't this with me a rant?
It was helpful.
Yeah,
You've got us more inspired
yeah.
for further ranting. Yeah. Stay tuned for rant point 2.
So until the next episode, thank you everyone for listening. Thanks, Jason.
Cheers.
Thanks, Jason.